How are drugs and medical devices regulated by the government, and what does that mean for my case? The United States Food and Drug Administration regulates many things, including food, radiation-emitting products, vaccines, blood, transplant materials, cosmetics, tobacco products, veterinary products, over-the-counter medications, and some nutritional products. Most importantly, the FDA regulates drug and medical devices, but the government's treatment of drugs and medical devices differs slightly. Drugs go through at least 3 phases of clinical trials over several years, which test the drugs on progressively larger groups of patients for safety. A drug must be successful in its clinical trials to receive approval. Following approval, there will be additional trials as the drug is used by the public. Throughout this time, doctors and patients are encouraged to report any adverse events to the FDA. These clinical trials are very expensive and usually unsuccessful, so pharmaceutical companies are permitted to patent their drugs, which grants a monopoly over manufacturing the drug for several years. Once the patent expires, other companies are permitted to make the drug, which is then considered the generic form of the brand name drug. Because generic drugs are usually less expensive, many healthcare insurers require patients to use generic drugs. Lawsuits against generic drug makers are very difficult because generic drug makers must essentially use the same label and warnings as the brand name drug makers. As such, generic drug makers are shielded from liability for failure to warn claims, the most prevalent claims in defective drug product liability lawsuits. Strangely, this could lead to 2 manufacturers making the same defective drug, but a patient taking the generic drug is left with no claims against the generic manufacturer. Medical devices face a different approval process. The FDA regulation of medical devices increases with the corresponding risk of illness or injury associated with the product. The class of medical devices posing the highest risk can go through a rigorous process called pre-market approval, or PMA. PMA is a long and costly process involving extensive review of the medical device. A shorter and cheaper process is known as 510(k) clearance, a reference to that section of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Like drugs, medical devices are also reviewed after approval, and both doctors and patients are encouraged to report any adverse events to the FDA through the manufacturer and user facility device experience, or MAUDE system. Under the more prevalent 510(k) clearance, a manufacturer only has to show that a medical device is substantially similar to an already legally marketed product. Because the PMA medical devices undergo much more scrutiny, it is harder to bring a lawsuit in those cases. Most of those claims are preempted based on the close government oversight and resulting approval involved. On the other hand, 510(k) medical devices do not share this type of immunity from suit, since 510(k) clearance requirements are just not as strict as PMA. All of this overlapping regulatory red tape may start to seem overwhelming, but it is important to keep in mind that the vast majority of these safeguards were put in place to protect patients. These, along with the product liability protections of various jurisdictions, have been successfully implemented by increased attorneys in countless instances. This has fostered a system whereby lawsuits on behalf of individual patients have been instrumental in making the market much safer for all patients.